Dr. Zix Norp took pride in his reputation as the calmest xenophysician in the Galactic Medical Alliance. He had handled everything: Villian polymorph breakdowns, Quillen spore eruptions, and even the explosive aftermath of a hyperinflated Zarblat. But none of that prepared him for the day a human stumbled into his med bay. Humans, the so-called Deathworlders of the galaxy. Zix had heard stories about them, bipedal beings from a perilous planet called Earth, supposedly resilient to the point of absurdity and reckless beyond reason. Zix dismissed these as exaggerations, at least until Jake Hold My Beard Johnson made his unforgettable entrance. The human staggered into the sterile room, dripping red liquid blood, Zix's logical processors informed him, and some strong-smelling amber substance that reeked of fermentation. Despite his obvious injuries, Jake was laughing loudly, which was disturbing enough without the added horror of his ribcage protruding like a nightmarish musical instrument. "Hey, Doc," Jake called out, voice slurring like a gelatin being left in the sun. "Think you can help me out? Got myself into a bit of trouble." Zix's 4 eyes blinked in unison, his tentacles curling instinctively. "By the infinite nebula," he muttered. "What in all the voids happened to you?" Jake's grin stretched wide, showing off unsettlingly sharp teeth. "Funny thing that me and the guys were having a little contest. A contest that involved dismantling your skeletal system." Zix cut in, his tone sharp with disbelief. Jake shook his head, wincing as the motion jostled his exposed ribs. "Nah, this part was a bit of a side effect. We were jumping hover bikes over a canyon full of acid-spewing plants. Guess who made it the farthest?" Zix could feel a phantom headache forming, despite not possessing the necessary anatomy. "Congratulations," he said flatly. "Your reward appears to be a swift trip to the grave." Jake only laughed harder. "Ah, don't be so dramatic, Doc. I've had way worse. Back on Earth, there was this one time." "Spare me the details," Zix interrupted, raising a tentacle to silence him. "I'm struggling to comprehend this disaster as it is." He guided Jake to the examination table, marveling at how the man remained conscious, let alone cheerful. Any other species would have succumbed to the injuries or at least been incapacitated. But here Jake was, cracking jokes and attempting to fist bump a med drone with his uninjured arm. "Mr. Johnson," Zix began, his tone shifting into strict professionalism, "I'll need to sedate you before proceeding." Jake pouted. "Ah, come on, document. I've patched myself up through worse." "Not today," Zix muttered as he prepped the sedative. Humans were a peculiar mix of indestructible and insane, and Zix had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time he'd encounter one. "Your injuries are severe," Zix Norp said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake waved a hand dismissively, narrowly missing a delicate piece of advanced medical equipment. "Nah, no big deal, document. Just hit me with some local anesthetic, and I'll walk you through it." Zix's bioluminescent spots flickered in sheer disbelief. "You want to remain conscious during this procedure? Why not?" Jake shrugged, immediately regretting it as his dislocated shoulder made a grotesque grinding sound. "Oh yeah, that's gonna sting later." Zix fixed him with a look that could freeze plasma. "Mr. Johnson," he began slowly, as if addressing a particularly dense larval Zorke, "you have multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and, if my scanners are correct, a piece of your hover bike embedded in your spleen. This is not a DIY project." Jake burst into laughter, a sound so carefree it sent an unsettling chill through Zix's neural ridges. "Relax, Doc. Where's your sense of adventure? Besides, I've done this before. Did I ever tell you about the time I took out my own appendix with a rusty spoon and a bottle of moonshine?" Zix felt his chromatophores shift to an alarming shade of green. "No," he replied dryly, "and I hope I never have to hear about it again." Despite every fiber of his medical training screaming at him to refuse, Zix found himself reluctantly agreeing. He reasoned this as a rare opportunity to study human resilience firsthand, not because the idea of Jake attempting surgery on himself was utterly terrifying. With a deep sigh, Zix began the meticulous process of extracting the foreign objects from Jake's body. These included, but were not limited to, shards of metal, plant thorns, and what appeared to be a small alien rodent, still hissing angrily. Throughout it all, Jake sat casually as if he were chatting at a cafe. "So, Doc," Jake said conversationally, as Zix worked to remove a particularly stubborn piece of shrapnel, "ever worked on a human before?" Zix carefully set the jagged metal fragment aside. "No, Mr. Johnson. You are my first human patient." Jake's face lit up with pride. "Well, how about that? I'm your first. Pop in your human cherry, huh?" Zix's translator hesitated before garbling out the phrase, leaving him momentarily baffled. He decided it was probably better not to ask. "Yes, and if all humans are as reckless as you, I sincerely hope you're also my last." "Ah, come on," Jake teased, grinning. "You're starting to like me. Admit it." Zix paused just long enough to respond dryly, like a particularly persistent fungal infection. Perhaps, as the procedure continued, Zix couldn't help but marvel at human biology. Every time he thought he understood, Jake's body defied his expectations. Incredible, Zix muttered, watching as the human's tissue began healing itself far faster than he had thought possible. It was equal parts fascinating and terrifying. Jake winked at him. Told ya, document built tough. Don't you worry, I'm gonna walk outta here good as new. Zix Norp sighed heavily, already regretting allowing himself to be dragged into the chaos that was Jake Johnson. Your cellular regeneration is extraordinary, Zix Norp observed, his voice tinged with disbelief. It's as though your body is eager to repair itself. Jake nodded, a smug grin on his battered face. Yep, we're pretty good at bouncing back. You should see how fast we heal paper cuts. It's practically a magic trick. Zix's medical scanners beeped erratically, struggling to keep up with the rapid changes happening in Jake's body. This defies every principle of known medical science, he muttered, more to himself than to Jake. Welcome to humanity, Doc, Jake replied with a wink. We're basically walking, talking middle fingers to the rules of biology. As Zix continued the painstaking work of mending Jake's many injuries, he found himself oddly entertained by his patient's endless chatter. Jake filled the time with wildly implausible stories about his exploits across the galaxy. And that's how I ended up arm wrestling a kraken on Europa, Jake concluded as Zix carefully realigned his shattered femur. I find your tales highly dubious, Zix said, a hint of reluctant amusement creeping into his voice. Jake grinned. This face doesn't lie, document. Considering half of it is currently swollen and disfigured, I couldn't possibly say, Zix replied dryly. Word of Jake's incredible tolerance, and his ability to carry on casual conversation during major surgery, spread quickly through the medical station. Before long, a crowd of alien doctors and nurses gathered outside the observation windows, their faces pressed against the glass in awe and horror. Dr. Quilk, a renowned neurosurgeon from the Andromeda Galaxy, burst into the operating room, his feathers fluffed with excitement. Is it true? He squawked. You're performing trauma surgery on a conscious human? Jake raised his good hand in greeting. Hey there, always happy to meet a fan. Want an autograph? Might be a bit smudgy, though. He wiggled his blood-covered fingers for emphasis. Dr. Quilk's beak opened wide in shock. This is impossible, he murmured. The pain alone should have rendered you unconscious, if not killed you outright. Pain's just weakness leaving the body, Jake quipped cheerfully. Or so my old drill sergeant said. Same guy also claimed dodging wrenches was good training for dodging plasma bolts, so take that with a grain of salt. Zix, still focused on the task of repairing Jake's extensive injuries, glanced up with a mix of irritation and wonder. I've administered enough anesthetic to tranquilize a Jurassic megalodon, and yet here you are, making jokes. I'm beginning to suspect humans don't actually feel pain. Perhaps you fake it to keep the rest of us from feeling inferior. Jake burst into laughter, then winced as his newly aligned ribs protested the movement. Oh, we feel it, all right. We just have a handy little feature called endorphins, nature's painkillers. Also, I might be in shock. It's always hard to tell. Dr. Quilk edged closer, his scientific curiosity outweighing his professional restraint. Remarkable. Are you saying this is a standard trait among your species? Pretty much, Jake said with a casual nod. We're adrenaline junkies with a side of masochism. It's why we do stuff like climb mountains without ropes, swim with sharks, and eat gas station sushi. Zix paused mid-suture, narrowing all four of his eyes at Jake in suspicion. You're joking about that last one, right? Zix asked cautiously. Jake's silence was far more unsettling than any confirmation. As the surgery continued, more alien doctors began to trickle into the operating theater, each finding flimsy excuses to witness the spectacle firsthand. They watched in stunned fascination as Jake's body seemed to repair itself in real time, his cells regenerating at a rate that defied all known biological principles. Despite his initial skepticism, Dr. Zix Norp found himself increasingly captivated by his extraordinary patient. Mr. Johnson, he said while carefully suturing a deep, jagged wound, I must admit, your species continues to astonish me. Your resilience is unparalleled. Jake flashed a grin, his teeth improbably pristine given the state of the rest of him. Ah, Doc, you're gonna make me blush. Or maybe that's just the blood loss talking. Dr. Quilk, who had unilaterally appointed himself as Jake's unofficial chronicler, scribbled furiously into a notebook. Human Jake, he began, his voice full of scientific curiosity. What do you attribute your species' remarkable abilities to? Genetics? Environment? Or perhaps some cosmic absurdity? Jake considered this for a moment, which was quite a sight given that Zix was, at that moment, reattaching his spleen. Probably a mix of all three. See, Earth's a mean old lady. Keeps us us on our toes with volcanoes, earthquakes, and, worst of all, politicians. Zix nodded solemnly. Ah yes, I've read about your politicians. Terrifying creatures. You don't even know the half of it, Doc, Jake chuckled. But yeah, I guess you could say humans are like those inflatable punching bags. You know, the ones that bounce back no matter how hard you hit them. Dr. Quilk's feathers fluffed with excitement. Fascinating. Are these punching bags part of your advanced combat training? Jake blinked. No, they're toys for kids. The gathered alien doctors exchanged horrified glances. Zix made a mental note to recommend a galaxy-wide embargo on human toy exports. By the 5th hour of surgery, Jake's constant stream of chatter began to shift into something more erratic. He moved from recounting his exploits to speculating on the mysteries of existence. Do you ever wonder, Jake slurred, his eyes slightly glassy, if maybe we're all just cells in some giant cosmic body? Like what we call the universe is actually, I don't know, it's pancreas or something. Zix, who was currently trying to disentangle Jake's small intestine from a piece of his hover bike's handlebars, sighed deeply. Mr. Johnson, if the universe were indeed a living organism and we were unfortunate enough to reside in its pancreas, we would have been digested long ago. Jake's face lit up with a bizarre enthusiasm. Oh, what if that's what black holes are? Cosmic stomach acids. Dr. Quilk, still scribbling notes, looked up, his expression a mix of awe and unease. Is this typical human behavior? Are they all secret philosophers? Zix shook his head with an exasperated sigh. No, Dr. Quilk, this is what humans refer to as rambling, a side effect of extreme blood loss and trauma. Jake gave an enthusiastic thumbs up with his uninjured hand. Yup, nailed it, Doc. Nailed it, document. Though, to be fair, I get pretty philosophical when I've had a drink or two, Jake said with a grin. Speaking of which, you wouldn't happen to have any of that fermented grain juice around, would you? Strictly medicinal, of course. Zix Norp's glare could have soured liquids light years away. Mr. Johnson, you are in the middle of major surgery. Alcohol is the absolute last thing you need. Jake pouted, an expression so absurd given his condition that Zix almost laughed. Ah, come on. Document ever heard of hair of the dog? Dr. Quilk's head tilted with curiosity. Hair of the dog? Is that some kind of human healing ritual? Does consuming canine fur provide medicinal benefits? Jake opened his mouth, no doubt ready to unleash a confusing explanation, but Zix quickly interjected. No, Dr. Quilk, it's a human idiom, one of many that make no sense whatsoever. Mr. Johnson, I must insist you stop exposing my colleagues to these pearls of wisdom. If their brains implode, I'll have no choice but to operate, and I only have one table. As the surgery progressed, the team grew increasingly amazed by Jake's healing ability. Bones that should have taken weeks to mend fused together in hours. Lacerations stitched moments before were already fading into faint scars. This is extraordinary, Dr. Crick exclaimed, feathers puffed with excitement. If we could replicate this regenerative capability, the potential for medical breakthroughs would be immeasurable. Jake, currently attempting to hum despite the breathing tube still in place, paused to respond. Sorry, Doc, but it's a human-exclusive feature. Plus, I'm pretty sure harvesting it would break like 100 intergalactic laws. Zix nodded solemnly. Not to mention the ethical dilemma of trying to recreate a healing factor fueled by reckless behavior and an apparent addiction to fermented grain products. Jake beamed. Now you're catching on. The secret to human resilience is simple. We're too stubborn to die and too clueless to realize when we should. Dr. Quilk blinked rapidly, his feathers quivering with confusion. That doesn't adhere to any scientific principles. Welcome to human biology, Jake said, laughing, where the rules are optional and nature just throws up its hands. As the final stages of surgery neared, the observing aliens watched in silent awe as Jake's body continued to defy their understanding. Bones realigned themselves, muscles knitted back together, and even his spleen, damaged beyond what Zix believed was reparable, resumed normal function. I've never encountered anything like this, Zix murmured, marveling as the last incision sealed itself without assistance. It's as if your body is impatient to heal. Jake flexed his newly repaired arm, wincing slightly. What can I say? We're built tough. Now, about that drink, well, you know what they say, Doc, Jake said with a smirk. The body's a temple, and I'm just a really enthusiastic handyman. Dr. Quilk, still feverishly taking notes, looked up with fascination. Incredible. Humans view their physical forms as sacred structures, and you personally ensure its maintenance. Jake blinked, then let out a laugh that made Zix Norp check his freshly repaired ribs with a worried glance. Not quite, document. It's just a figure of speech. If anything, I worship at the church of adrenaline and poor life choices. Zix sighed, the kind of weary exhale that seemed to resonate from the depths of his being. Mr. Johnson, I think we've had enough human idioms for one day. Any more, and I'll be operating on my colleague's overworked brains next. As the surgery wrapped up, the gathered alien doctors began chattering excitedly about the implications of what they had witnessed. The room filled with the sound of squawks, hums, and the occasional bubbling from species with aquatic origins. The potential is astounding. We need to research this further. Do you think all humans are this resilient? One of them asked. Jake, ever eager to contribute, chimed in. Oh, I'm nothing special. You should meet my grandma. She once arm wrestled a bear for the last slice of pie at a family picnic. The room fell into stunned silence as every alien eye, or equivalent sensory organ, focused on Jake. Zix Norp, whose eye twitch had developed into a steady rhythm, pressed his equivalent of a nose bridge in exasperation. Mr. Johnson, we've already discussed the questionable nature of your stories. Jake's grin, still lopsided from residual swelling, widened. Hey, would this face lie to you? Given that it's been rearranged multiple times today, I'm not sure it's a trustworthy reference point, Zix replied dryly. As Zix conducted a final scan to ensure everything was in working order, or as close as human anatomy allowed, Jake decided it was the perfect moment for some comedy. Propping himself up on his elbows, he grinned. Hey, Doc, what do you call a doctor who fixes broken planets? Zix, against his better judgment, played along. I don't know, Mr. Johnson. What do you call a doctor who fixes broken planets? A world-renowned physician, Jake announced proudly, looking far too pleased with himself. The silence that followed was almost palpable, the kind of pause that accompanies the collective effort of dozens of alien minds grappling with the concept of humor. Dr. Quilk let out a noise somewhere between a squawk and a sneeze, his feathers puffing in what Jake optimistically took as amusement. I don't get it, gurgled a gelatinous doctor from the back. Planets aren't living entities. They don't require medical care. Exactly, Jake said, his grin stretching wider. It's funny because it doesn't make any sense. Zix Norp, silently pleading with any benevolent cosmic force for the patients to finish this procedure without strangling his patient, exhaled a long, weary sigh. Mr. Johnson, I believe you've single-handedly set interspecies relations back by at least a century. Ah, come on, Doc, Jake replied, feigning offense. You've got to admit, it's pretty impressive that I'm cracking jokes while you're literally putting my guts back where they belong. As much as Zix hated to admit it, Jake had a point. Despite his grotesque injuries, invasive surgery, and the incessant questions from the curious alien medical team, Jake had maintained an unwavering level of cheerfulness that bordered on madness. Zix completed the final scans, setting the device aside with a mix of exhaustion and reluctant admiration. Humans, he realized, were an enigma, fragile yet unyielding, reckless yet oddly resourceful. Somehow, they treated life-threatening situations as minor inconveniences. Well, Mr. Johnson, Zix announced, his tone resigned, you've made a full recovery. Against all logic, and in defiance of multiple biological principles, I might add. Jake sat up with the ease of someone waking from a nap rather than someone who had just undergone hours of surgery. Thanks, Document. You're a real hero. Literally, Dr. Quilk, still brimming with enthusiasm, stepped forward. This is incredible. Mr. Johnson, would you consider staying for additional testing? The scientific community would greatly benefit from. That won't be necessary, Zix interjected, surprised by the protective edge in his own voice. Mr. Johnson has been through quite enough for one day. He needs rest. Jake, however, was already swinging his legs over the side of the table. Rest? Nah, I'm feeling great. Say, Doc, are there any decent bars on this station? Feels like a good time to celebrate cheating death. Zix's eye twitch returned with a vengeance. Mr. Johnson, you've just undergone major surgery. Even with your remarkable healing abilities, your body requires time to recover. Jake waved off the concern with a nonchalant grin. Don't sweat it, Document. A little hair of the dog, and I'll be good as new. Dr. Quilk perked up at the phrase, feathers bristling with curiosity. Hair of the dog? Is this another human healing technique? Does canine fur hold medicinal properties? Jake opened his mouth, undoubtedly ready to spin another baffling explanation, but Zix cut him off with a sharp gesture. No, Dr. Quilk, it's yet another nonsensical human saying. Mr. Johnson, Zix turned to his patient, fixing all four eyes on him with stern intensity. I strongly advise you to remain here for observation, at least for a few hours. Jake's face morphed into an exaggerated pout. Ah, come on, Document. I'm perfectly fine. Look, I'll prove it. Before anyone could react, Jake leapt off the operating table with a flourish. Jake landed with a theatrical flourish, arms spread wide as if he just stuck the landing in some intergalactic gymnastics competition. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Then, everything happened at once. Dr. Quilk squawked in amazement, his feathers fluffing up with excitement. The gelatinous doctor with the AO promptly fainted, collapsing into a quivering puddle on the floor. And Zix Norp, despite his years of training and carefully cultivated composure, face-palmed with all 4 tentacles simultaneously. Jake, oblivious to the chaos he'd caused, beamed. See? Good as new. Now, about that bar. Zix Norp sighed, the sound of a being resigned to his fate. Very well, Mr. Johnson, but I'm coming with you. Someone has to ensure you don't end up back in my med bay before the night is over. Jake's grin widened impossibly. Now you're getting it, Doc. I'll show you how humans celebrate surviving near-death experiences. You're in for a treat. As Zix reluctantly followed Jake out of the med bay, he couldn't help but question his decision. This was bound to be a disaster, or, at the very least, a lesson in why humans should never be left unsupervised. Behind them, Dr. Quilk's eager voice echoed down the hallway. Wait, Mr. Johnson, I still have questions. What is a fiddle, and how does one measure its fitness? Zix groaned internally. It was shaping up to be a very long night. As they navigated the station's winding corridors, Jake regaled Zix with tales of his previous exploits. Each story was more outrageous than the last, leaving Zix caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. And that's how I ended up arm wrestling a Kren on Europa, Jake said, concluding yet another unbelievable tale as they rounded a corner. Zix's tentacles twitched in bemusement. I struggle to believe any of that actually happened, he replied, his tone walking the fine line between exasperation and reluctant amusement. Jake shot him a wink. Ah, come on, document. Would this face lie to you? Zix's 4 eyes narrowed slightly. Considering half of it was unrecognizable mere hours ago, I can't say your face inspires much confidence. As they approached the station's bustling social hub, a cacophony of alien sounds and scents greeted them. The bar, or what passed for one, was a chaotic melting pot of species from across the galaxy. Beings of all shapes, sizes, and compositions mingled, each indulging in their preferred form of intoxication. Jake's eyes lit up like a child stepping into a candy shop. Now this is my kind of place. Hey, Doc, what's your poison? Zix blinked, all 4 eyes in confusion. Poison, Mr. Johnson? I fail to see why I would willingly ingest something toxic. Jake laughed, clapping Zix on what he hoped was the alien's back. Relax, document. It's just an expression. I meant, what are you drinking? Ah, Zix said, still grappling with human idioms. I'll have a glass of nutrient-rich photosynthetic solution. I remain on duty, after all. Jake scrunched his face in mock disgust. That sounds about as exciting as doing taxes. Come on, Doc, live a little. What about that one? He pointed to a bubbling green drink being served to what appeared to be sentient gas clouds. Zix Norp's chromatophores flickered a warning shade of yellow. Mr. Johnson, that beverage is corrosive to most carbon-based life forms. It would quite literally dissolve your insides. Jake's grin only grew wider. Perfect. Make it 2. Before Zix could protest, Jake was already striding up to the bar. The bartender, a multi-limbed, multi-eyed alien with an air of perpetual skepticism, regarded Jake with cautious curiosity. Sir, it gurgled. Are you certain your species can handle this drink? It's not exactly safe. Jake waved dismissively. Don't worry about me, pal. I've got a cast iron stomach. Besides, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Zix, having caught up with his reckless patient, jumped in. Actually, Mr. Johnson, countless substances, while not immediately fatal, can cause irreparable damage to, but it was already too late. Jake had snatched the bubbling green concoction and, with an enthusiastic cheers, tipped it back in one gulp. For a moment, the entire bar fell silent. Dozens of alien eyes, sensors, and other assorted observation mechanisms locked onto the human who had just consumed a drink known to melt starship hulls. Jake froze. His eyes widened. His face turned an alarming shade of purple, and then, the deafening belch rattled the walls, causing a nearby light fixture to flicker ominously. Jake slammed the empty glass on the bar with a triumphant grin. Woo, that's got a kick. Tastes like jet fuel mixed with my grandma's chili sauce. Pour me another. The bartender, momentarily paralyzed, silently poured another drink, its many eyes wide with disbelief. Meanwhile, Zix Norp frantically scanned Jake with every medical device at his disposal. This is impossible, he muttered. Your digestive system should be dissolving right now. How are you still alive, let alone functioning? Jake flashed a grin, his teeth now faintly glowing green. Told you, document cast iron stomach. Now, let's see what else this place has on the menu. What followed was an increasingly surreal parade of drinks. Jake sampled concoctions that defied the laws of physics, cocktails existing in multiple dimensions at once, and one particularly infamous brew that temporarily turned him inside out. Through it all, Zix Zix watched in a mix of horrified fascination and grudging respect. Every scan, every analysis, every logical conclusion screamed that Jake should be dead 10 times over. And yet, he remained standing, laughing, joking, and apparently having the time of his life. By the end of the night, Jake was glowing faintly in several colors, some of which weren't visible to most species. Slurring his words but still inexplicably upright, he leaned over to Zix with a conspiratorial grin. "You know, Doc," he said, wobbling slightly on his barstool, "I think I've cracked the secret to the universe." Zix, who had long since resigned himself to the absurdity of the evening, sighed heavily. "And what's that, Mr. Johnson?" Jake leaned closer, nearly toppling over in the process. "The secret is, hiccup, there is no secret. It's all just one big cosmic joke, and we're the punchline." With that profound, or perhaps profoundly drunken declaration, Jake promptly passed out, face first onto the bar with a resounding thud. Zix Norp stared at the unconscious human for a long moment, his tentacles still as his mind processed the evening's events. Then, to his own surprise, he started to laugh. At first, it was a low, hesitant chuckle, but it quickly grew into a deep, uncontrollable guffaw that sent his tentacles writhing with mirth. Around him, the bar fell silent. Patrons stared, wide-eyed, at the phenomenon unfolding before them, an alien doctor laughing. Everyone knew xenophysicians didn't laugh. It was practically written into their biology. But as Zix looked down at Jake, a being who had cheated death, endured unimaginable injuries, and then drunk his way through half the galaxy's most dangerous beverages, he couldn't help but see the humor in it all. Perhaps Jake was onto something. Maybe the universe was a cosmic joke, and humans, with their reckless resilience and bafflingly poor decision-making, were its ultimate punchline. Shaking his head, still chuckling, Zix hoisted Jake's unconscious form over his shoulder, silently grateful for his own species' strength. As he made his way out of the bar, he mentally drafted an update for the Galactic Medical Alliance's files on humans. Under treatment protocols, he would simply write, "Good luck," and under special notes, he'd add, "Warning, may induce unexpected laughter in medical professionals. Approach with caution and a strong sense of humor." As Zix carried Jake back to the med bay, preparing for yet another round of impossible recovery, he felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. The universe, he realized, was far stranger and far more ridiculous than he'd ever given it credit for. And humans? They were in a category all their own.